I am taking over the podcast now, the Shortcut You podcast. Now it's the Shortcut Me podcast. Oh, I need to deadlift 660, or I need to look like an absolute monster, and not be able to fit through doorways in order to be jacked and strong. You can get your lats, upper back, biceps, triceps, chest, front delts. You can give all those muscle groups a top stimulus in literally, like, if you were to make a bet, 5 minutes. And you can be very creative with how you get that in. And the good thing with science is that science has showed us that, look, you want to do 20 reps for hypertrophy, do 20 reps. Want to do 5 to 10 reps, do that. Want to use free weights? Sure. Want to use your body weight? Fine. Want to use machines? Okay. Like, things are very flexible.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 2 of the Shortcut You podcast. I recently sat down with Patroklos Androulakis Korakakis, more commonly known as Dr. Pack, who is a Ph.D. in sports science and an expert in the topic of the minimum effective dose for resistance training, which is essentially the least amount that we need to do in order to gain strength and muscle mass benefits of resistance training. I really enjoyed talking to Dr. Pack. This minimum effective dose topic is an interesting one because I think, at least in my experience, looking across social media and YouTube and other sources, a lot of the focus in the health and fitness world, especially pertaining to resistance training, is geared towards optimizing outcomes. But for most people, I think, in the general public, the minimum effective dose is much more useful and realistic. Anyways, before we get started, there are a few things I want to touch on. First, I did have some technical difficulties while talking with Dr. Pack. You'll see that I cut out a couple times in the video, but I did a decent job of patching things up. If you are like me and listen to your podcasts on 2x or 3x the speed, then you probably won't notice any differences. But if you're just listening on normal speed, you might see that there are some gaps where nobody's talking, and then also there might be some odd transitions. But in general, I think you should be able to still gain a lot from the conversation. The other thing I want to address is that I realize I didn't do a great job of breaking things down for people who may not be super familiar with the concepts and research that we talk about. It's really easy to just kind of speak with someone like Dr. Pack, who is familiar with the research, uh, and not break things down in a way that somebody else who isn't as familiar would be able to understand. So for that reason, I want to just define a few points that I have written down. First, volume is essentially a measure of how much work we're doing in the gym when it comes to resistance training. And one way of measuring this is by multiplying the sets times the reps times the weight. This is more of a kind of scientific calculation, showing literally the amount of weight we're moving in a given week or training session. A more common way or simpler way of describing this is simply how many hard sets you're doing per muscle group or per exercise per session or per week. Next is proximity to failure, which is a term that describes how hard you're training, and it basically describes how close you're going to the point where you can no longer lift the weight at all with good form, which is called failure. And one way of kind of calculating this or measuring this is RIR, or reps in reserve, which basically describes how many reps away you are from that point where you can no longer move the weight at all. So an RIR of 2 would mean that you have 2 more reps left in the tank before you hit that point of failure. Next is multi-joint versus single joint movements, which are also commonly known as compound and isolation movements, respectively. Basically, multi-joint movements are your bigger movements that, as the name implies, use multiple joints. So like a bench press or a squat. Bench press involves motion at the elbow and the shoulder. The squat involves motion at the ankle, knee, and the hip. Isolation exercises or single joint exercises are more simple movements that involve less muscle groups. So common ones would be like a bicep curl, a tricep extension, or like a leg extension. And lastly, we talked a little bit about more advanced so-called intensity techniques, like drop sets and myoreps. Drop sets are when you essentially complete a massive set. You start off with one weight, you go until failure, and then you drop the weight a little bit lower. You go until failure again, and then you drop a little bit lower and go until failure again. Each little segment occurring without any rest in between the previous kind of bout to failure. Myo reps are similar, except you don't change the weight. So you would do a set of dumbbell curls with 30 pounds, for example, to failure. You would wait, maybe 10, 20, 30 seconds, and then go and do another set to failure. Both of these are methods to minimize the amount of time it takes to complete a bunch of sets and get a greater stimulus than you would get from just doing one set, one regular standard set. And lastly, supersets are essentially when you complete 2 exercises back to back without rest in between. In terms of which exercises, you could have competing supersets where you complete 2 exercises back to back that work the same muscle group. So, like push ups and bench press, for example. And non competing supersets would be where you do complete 2 exercises back to back that don't utilize the same muscle groups. So, this would be like pull ups supersetted with bench press. And I think that should cover the basis for much of what we talk about here. With that, you should be able to understand most of the concepts. Anyways, with that, we will get right into it. Patroklos Androulakis Korakakis. First off, am I the first one to successfully say your name?
You're not the first one, but that was a really like a solid. It wasn't even an attempt. You absolutely nailed it, and I will be sending you your Greek passport, citizenship, and bill for the debts that you've inherited from the Greek people. So thank you so much for saving my country. You now owe a lot of money to a lot of other countries. Thanks so much.
Worth it. Definitely worth it. I may have listened to you pronounce it in videos on YouTube for hours in preparation, but that doesn't matter. The outcome does. So your Ph.D. is in sports science, and you focus particularly on minimum effective dose training for strength athletes, so improving strength. And I want to talk a lot about that. But before we do, I'm curious what your kind of framework is for thinking about strength. I know, like in general, most people would just think of it through like 1 rep max. For me, when I think about training for strength, I kind of think of it in like 3 prongs. The first being muscular. First, how much muscle you have to activate and use, and also kind of the quality, being like type 2 versus type 1 breakdown. The second kind of prong being one of the neural portions revolving around how well you can activate and use that muscle, which I kind of think about through the concept of like a strength deficit, where if you were to voluntarily try to lift as much weight as you could, you'd probably be able to lift less than how much you could involuntarily if we just like put probes on you and like maximally activated your muscles. And then the third prong is also kind of neural, which is like the skill and technique aspect. Not only like getting proper leverages and stuff, like, typical powerlifting form critiques and stuff, but also like synchronizing different muscle groups that are involved. I'm curious if I was just spewing a bunch of nonsense for the past minute, or if you agree with any of that, or kind of how you think of that.
Allow me to start by drinking my own Kool-Aid, and I am drinking Kool-Aid indeed. I brought back some from the U.S. Let me just have a sip because I said it now.
Oh, of course.
That said, I really like the way you presented it, because people, will often say things like, I'm just trying to get, I want to get stronger, or I'm doing this program because I care about strength, or you're not going to get stronger following this other program that is more like muscle building related. And I do feel like we often forget that 1 repetition maximum strength in particular exercises, it does not necessarily represent the definition of strength in general, if that makes sense. The same way for a lot of people, you look at, like, let's say a rugby player, or American football player, or shall I say football player, please, my green card, thank you, that's whoever's listening. But For the average individual, they will look at that person and they will regard them as very strong because of their build and because they're capable to push other people and to exert force and whatnot. Not necessarily because their one repetition maximum strength in a particular lift is a certain number. And the reality is they're probably weaker in that particular skill than other people that would be considered weaker by general standards or by their sports standards. So strength can be the definition of strength the same way the definition of functional can vary depending on the task that is presented upon you. The definition of strength will also be sometimes context dependent. So I definitely agree with the way you presented it, and I'm of a similar opinion. However, my research specifically focused on one repetition maximum strength in powerlifters, which, if we're being fair, is, I'd say, an accurate representation of the definition of strength for the majority of lifters, in the serious lifters in the gym. So usually strength in a resistance training context is measured as one repetition maximum strength, or at least maximal strength.
Gotcha. All right, cool. So then let's dive into your kind of PhD thesis a little bit. I'll ask you the same question I asked Milo, which is what kind of brought you to be interested in that topic? He told me that he thinks you're just lazy and wanted to find out the least amount you could do. Also, I didn't tell you this before you came on, but one of the big reasons I have you on is to spark controversy between you and Milo so that I could have you on eventually for a debate and then get a bunch of views. And I know you kind of already set it up for me a little bit because he acts like he gets all the credit for the long length research stuff, and yet your name was also on the meta-analysis for range of motion, and you recently got back at him by taking first author on the technique paper, which talks a lot about lengthened partials and everything. So anyway, you've kind of set it up for me well already. I plan on putting you two friends against each other. Makes great TV. With that saying, what got you interested in minimum effective training and stuff like that for your PhD?
Yeah. Allow me to say that Milo is absolutely right about the laziness part. It wasn't laziness, but and joking aside, okay, allow me to say the disclaimers first. He does absolutely deserve all the clout and the credit for the ROM stuff. And yeah, on the technique paper, we did touch on ROM, and I feel a lot of people have taken it as a like partials at long muscle length sort of spin-off, when in reality the paper just says, hey, make sure you bias long muscle lengths when you're maximizing hypertrophy, like whether you want to use a full ROM or, partials, or whether you want to do like almost a full ROM. Like we still don't know 100% if that's going to make a huge difference. Just make sure that you get a stretch. But all that to say that one of the reasons I really liked the concept of the minimum effective training dose was that as a lifter, even though I now do train with a minimum effective training dose on some things here and there, back then when I started looking into the concept, I did not want to train with the least I could possibly do, but I wanted to know what's the least I could possibly do so that I can have this sort of mental so that I can feel a bit more at ease when busy periods in my life came up or when I had to travel. So yes, that played a role. But the whole idea came on the back of a pilot study that is called reduced volume daily max, and I'm just waiting for that. Reduced volume daily max training compared to a higher volume periodized training in powerlifters preparing for a competition, which was a pilot study that we did in Greece, where we essentially had access to a bunch of powerlifters, and we were like, okay, let's see what's the least they can do and still make gains without necessarily thinking of the minimum effective dose concept. And when we did that study and I saw that, oh, okay, people were making some gains even with as low as like a few single repetitions per week, I was like, what do we know about the least one can do? And turns out we didn't know much. We knew quite a bit in general, because like we had a ton of research on we had some research on like single set training, and like low volume training in general, but in a population like powerlifters and more specifically one repetition maximum strength and like highly trained individuals, there wasn't much. So I was like, okay, let's look at that. Like, that sounds interesting, and I think a lot of people could benefit from it, and it's a novel contribution to knowledge. So that's what I went for.
Sweet. Yeah, and I think it's easy. I don't know, maybe you can relate just based on like what I see in my feed. Being someone who's like really interested in the gym and health and fitness and stuff, a lot of what's online is geared towards more optimal outcomes. And I think that kind of skews the perspective where most people that like I talk to would probably mostly be interested in more of a minimum effective dose and don't want to be spending like, 20 hours in the gym a week to get the, benefits, whether it be health wise or aesthetics or whatever. So I think that is really geared towards a large portion of the population.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, and that's something I've realized as well. Like in our echo chamber, keep in mind, like we love to geek out over anything lifting related, and we often forget that the majority of people that go to gyms exist outside of our echo chamber. So like the majority of people that go to the gym and want to look good and be strong don't think, oh, I need to deadlift 660 or I need to look like an absolute monster and not be able to fit through doorways in order to be jacked and strong. Their definition of strength and just overall like building a muscular or a healthy or a fit physique is much different. And the reality of things is that I do believe that we have enough data to feel confident that with much less sort of training volume and overall focus on details, one can achieve an impressive physique and an impressive level of strength. And I'm happy that the minimum effective training dose concept has allowed both advanced individuals and individuals who may be more like hobbyists, but complete casuals. It has allowed them to feel at ease and be like, oh, okay, if I train hard and I train consistently, even if I have a few months here and there where I'm just doing, a handful or even less than a handful of sets per lift or per muscle group per week, I'm still making solid gains. Sure, I could have been making more gains, but, I'm happy to give up that extra 10% or whatever of potential muscle gain for more time, for less, less mental sort of fatigue. Because for a lot of people thinking ahead and being like, okay, this is another week where I have to go to work or school or I have a family and I need to do another 4 2-hour sessions in the gym, even like removing that feeling and being like, you know what, you can do 3 sessions, 30 minutes each, and you'll definitely make some gains. I think that that's great, and it's great to hear positive feedback around the concept. So we are doing our best to make the world lazier and allow them to settle for less. This is the motto here.
I think going back to what you were saying, one of the benefits also of like exploring the minimum effective dose is from like have you ever heard the phrase like majoring in the minor, minoring in the major? I think it's beneficial because by finding out what's really important for making gains, it allows us to not freak out over little things that otherwise wouldn't really make a huge difference, like the perfect rep tempo or stuff like that. Like if we identify just if we get like volume and proximity to failure right, or whatever it may be, the rest, sure, we might lose a little bit here or maybe gain a little bit here, but as long as we're covering those things, we'll be okay. I remember like in college, I had a friend who liked to go to the gym, and he got sick for like a week, maybe not even. Like he missed like a few days at the gym, and he was like, dude, you can't miss a single day. I lost 50% of my bench press. And I was like, no, you didn't. But just like, one, it could be helpful for us, like not losing our minds, going over the nitty gritty, but also, again, for like the general population, leading them towards prioritizing the right things can be really valuable, especially considering they're probably more likely to stick to resistance training or exercising in general if they know that they don't have to do everything to perfection 3 hours a day to the death, limping out of the gym, that type of stuff.
Yeah. And perfection without wanting to be that guy. Like, I would argue that being consistent and lifting while also doing 300 other things in your life, even if you're not, like, you got to view things holistically. Let's say, like, okay, yeah, if your life is being a lifter and you're, I don't know, you've inherited millions and you're like, okay, my whole living sort of purpose is to lift, sure. You know, you skipping a week here and there is probably not aligning much with your personal goals, and you shouldn't be, in theory, skipping those days because that's your whole life's purpose and you don't have to worry about anything else. And I don't think anybody like that exists in the world. But if we view it holistically, the majority of people have other responsibilities, other goals, and other sides to themselves. And I would say that achieving perfection is not so much about achieving perfection in all those, in each individual sort of component in your life, but rather having a more holistic view of quote unquote perfection. So the person who tries to force the 6 sessions a week and a ton of training volume ends up missing half of them, then feels bad, and then that negative sort of mindset then transfers it to other areas in his life, or maybe they miss then a whole week because, oh, I don't have time to get all those sessions in, and then they just sort of start viewing themselves more as a failure. I think on the other side, the person who's like, okay, I'm still gonna engage in hard resistance training. I'm still gonna go to the gym and get some hard sets in. It's still gonna be hard work. It still requires mental effort, but I can see that I'm not able to optimize now, or at least it's not gonna benefit me. I don't care about that extra 5%, and I have other things that I need to tend to that are also important, like my family or my career. So I would say that, yeah, it's people often sort of have this tunnel vision with being perfect in the gym, when when in other areas of their life they are simply more than okay with, you know, being really good at something, if that makes sense, right? But sorry, I wanted to also touch on the majoring in the minors, and I think that's a big, like, trap that a lot of people fall into. It's like, sure, we could in theory argue that, oh, maybe if you did this exercise instead of that exercise, you could be looking at some additional gain in theory, because, like, it's likely that we won't have any direct evidence to reassure us. But then it's like, and I've said like quite a bit here, but then at the end of the day, it probably doesn't matter as much. Yes, I'm not saying do 1 set per muscle group per week for the rest of your life. And if you want to make substantial gains, and there are a lot of people that are not genetically blessed that will need to push their volume higher and so on and so forth. But even that, like doing 5 to 10 sets per muscle group per week, it's not that much training volume. It doesn't require that much time commitment. And as long as you're picking like a couple of exercises per body part, and you're pushing yourself hard and making sure you're adding weight and or reps every week, like, I would argue that you don't need to know much more to achieve a great physique and an impressive level of strength. Again, for general people standards, right? I'm not saying you're going to be deadlifting 600 for reps. No, thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I feel like a lot of people, because it's a multi-experiment paper, which is not, it's not common at all in sports science. I don't think I have seen many, if any. I've seen some in psychology, but I didn't want to essentially have 5 papers out in the literature that are on different journals that, you know, one may be published before the other one, and then people report on that one, and then people remember just that one but then miss out on the other one. I thought, hey, it makes much more sense to publish everything as one paper, even if, you know, you have to sacrifice citations and all that BS. To answer the first question, I've, like, from a hypertrophy standpoint, you can make meaningful gains, I think, with, you know, just a couple of sets per week, 1 to 2 sets per muscle group per week. But from what the current literature shows, like, if you were to just up that to like 4 to 6 sets per muscle group per week, or let's say 3 to 6 sets per muscle group per week, you may be looking at substantially more gains without necessarily having to commit that much more time. And I think that, okay, sure, if you're the one guy who's so busy and the only thing you can do is 1 to 2 sets per muscle group per week, and you don't have the extra, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 minutes per week to dedicate, you know, to your whole training, fair enough. But just being in the 3 to 6, being between 3 to 6 sets per muscle group per week, I think is a solid way to ensure that you're not just making some gains, but that those gains are meaningful. So, as far as strength goes, things look very similar. Like the volume prescription would be similar. Obviously, for strength, if we know that it's probably best to opt for heavier loads and potentially leave a few more reps in the tank than you would for hypertrophy sets. So those 3 to 6 sets for hypertrophy can be in any rep range you like, as long as you are very close to failure, and I'm talking like 0 to 2 reps in reserve. For strength, ideally, you'd be in the 1 to 5 rep range so that you can use a weight that is heavy enough. And although our studies did not look at sets terminated at far from failure, but rather very close to failure, because I thought, okay, we're having these people do so little volume that it's probably best if we keep specificity very high and have them, lift heavy, like near max loads every day, so that they can get better, essentially at the test that they're being tested on, which is a 1 repetition maximum strength test. But I think that you could take the concept of the minimum dose, do 3 to 6 sets per lift per week in the 1 to 5 rep range, leave 2 to 3 reps in reserve, and make meaningful gains, which in our studies we defined by asking powerlifting athletes and coaches what they deem as meaningful. I think as far as like a powerlifting total increase, meaningfulness for 6 weeks was set at around, take this with a pinch of salt, at around 38.5 pounds. I had to convert from kilos. But it's important to also understand that will depend on your strength level. It will depend on your personal goals, personal experience. Maybe it may be lift specific. So for me personally, if I was to gain 12 kilos, 12.5 kilos specifically on my deadlift and reach 300, and that's taken some years now. Obviously, I haven't been really focusing on chasing that, but that increase for me would be meaningful. But in order for us to G-check, as they say in science, ourselves and make sure that, the meaningfulness standards of the coaches and athletes were not just random, because you could, that's a risk there. Like the risk there is that we could have just asked some random coaches and athletes, and they said, this number seems like a nice threshold cutoff point for meaningfulness, but in reality that doesn't really make sense. But we actually looked at the amount of strength gain required in order to move up one placing in IPF competitions. And you can find all that, like the detailed analysis and the methods for that on the paper itself. If you go to minimumdose.training, if you type that in your browser, it will take you to a Linktree sort of page, and it has all those studies there. And we essentially compared what the coaches and athletes said with, like, it was like subjective versus objective. And those pretty much, they didn't align perfectly, but they were very close. And which was cool to see, because it's common to talk about statistical significance, and we've seen that in the past few months as well with some studies that have come out, and people are like, oh, this wasn't statistically significant, but then it's like, yeah, guys, but if we look at the actual numbers, it may be of practical meaningfulness. The same way if I said, oh, these guys gained X amount of weight on their squat, bench, and deadlift, and they were elite lifters, but it wasn't statistically significant, a lot of us, including myself, may turn around and be like, yeah, okay, it wasn't statistically significant, but this is an increase that I, as a coach, would consider practically very meaningful, especially in specific populations. The same with muscle growth. If you were to look at bodybuilders, like advanced bodybuilders, and you saw that they gained some muscle mass that could potentially come up as statistically insignificant, I do feel like a lot of both coaches and athletes would turn around and say, yeah, it didn't reach statistical significance, and that could be because of a plethora of reasons, including sample size, maybe the statistical approach that was taken was not the most appropriate, and so on and so forth. But they may turn around and say, you know what, like half a pound or 1 pound gained in X amount of time for those individuals, that's insane. That's amazing.
I think that that was a really interesting kind of approach of taking into account statistical significance versus clinical significance, or like practical significance, like what you're saying. So, you were talking about clinically meaningful results that would make a difference, to a competitive athlete or maybe just a layperson that weren't statistically significant. But then on the other end, there are also probably plenty of examples of statistically significant findings that didn't occur by chance, but still didn't show any meaningful difference from like an ecological perspective, like when you actually apply it in real life. And I talked to Milo a little bit about kind of like the arbitrariness of statistical significance and this p-value being set at 0.05 and all that. And it seems like in exercise science, at least, I've seen a bigger movement towards more probabilistic type stuff, and even moving like the p-value towards 0.1. I think in some of like Brad Schoenfeld's papers, I've seen him, or I guess the whole group of people working on the paper list p equals or p less than 0.05 being statistically significant, and then less than 0.1 being a trend, still leaving like room for there being a meaningful finding in the study, even if it's not technically statistically significant based on more like strict standards.
Yeah, and like that's something like Brad Schoenfeld has been quite vocal about, like being against statistical significance as the years have passed, and this is something that a lot of people fail to like. They don't want to understand it. Like everybody talks about people improving and learning, and even my own PhD supervisor slash director of studies, who loves stats and is an extremely like bright mind and also creative, out of the box thinker, and he informed the statistical analysis to an extreme extent when it came to my PhD. Like if you look at some of his older papers, he was using very basic stats that he himself now wouldn't use. But as researchers, we evolve, and obviously we are in a field that is relatively new. And if we look at like sports science papers from back in the day, a lot of the practices that were common are not seen, are not would be frowned upon by a lot of us nowadays. Even simple things like pre-printing, which is still frowned upon for some reason. Anyways, all that to say that just because we've used something in the past or we've done things in a specific way, that does not necessarily mean that we should be sticking by that no matter what. Same goes for study designs and being a bit more not liberal, but like borrowing from other fields, like for example like doing more qualitative stuff, and like the multi-experiment design that I mentioned. Anyways, all that to say that, hey, just because things have been done in a specific way and we were used to interpreting results in a specific way, that shouldn't be the end all be all if a sufficient argument is presented for why that may not be appropriate.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In addition to that kind of 5-part study, you also, I think it was a little further back, maybe in 2020, you did the meta-analysis. And I'm interested, as with all kind of meta-analyses, you sacrifice a little bit of specificity or like ecological validity, because not all of the studies are going to have the same exact design, right? And if you try to pin down on one particular design for your inclusion criteria, you reduce the amount of studies you can include, and that kind of defeats the whole purpose of the meta-analysis of combining a bunch of studies. So my point for bringing this up is you kind of use inclusion criteria of sets per exercise per session, right? Which one was one way of doing it. And for half of the 6 studies that you selected, if you go back and look at what they tested, like squat 1RM or bench press 1RM, they literally came down to 2 or maybe 3 sets of related exercises to those 1RMs per week. Whereas for some of the other studies, like the Schoenfeld one, they were doing, I think, 6 sets per week that were targeting muscle groups or movements related to bench press, and I think it was 9 sets for exercises or stuff that was related to squat. So if you kind of break it down and look at things that way, I'm curious if any studies stand out to you in particular as being particularly ecologically valid, that you can have takeaways kind of separate from the meta-analysis as a whole, or maybe just using that isolation view of one study and taking that in perspective of all of the other studies combined.
Yeah, that's very well pointed out, and that's another reality that a lot of people fail to grasp. That when you start looking behind the scenes, like when I started doing the literature review, I was like, okay, let's see what the literature now has to say as far as minimum dose training goes. And I didn't expect much on powerlifters, if any, because I knew that the studies using actual powerlifters are limited. But I was very surprised that okay, when it comes to bench, squat, bench, and deadlift, although, sure, powerlifting movements, but they are, the big three, the strength movements, no matter what, even if you're not a powerlifter. We didn't find much studies. As you said, the design was different. Some studies included other exercises that, targeted the triceps, the chest, the quads, the glutes, and obviously they were not designed to explore the concept of the minimum dose. So keep in mind that that's another limitation of the meta-analysis itself. So I would say that I wouldn't necessarily look at any of those studies in there for ecological validity in the context of, minimum effective training dose for 1 repetition maximum strength in advanced and trained individuals. That's where I would look at the multi-experiment paper, because we don't just have the intervention data, because the intervention data, again, small sample sizes, limitations. The pilot study, we did the testing in a competition environment. We're talking about just powerlifters, but the triangulation of the intervention and the interview data is what allows me to be a bit more confident. And obviously, since the P.h.D. has come out and all the studies of the P.h.D. are published, there were a lot of people that reached out with it, their own anecdotal experiences, and it's been all solid. People have come out and said, "Oh, I've done this in the past, or I've tried it and has worked well for me." But I digress. So the triangulation of the interview data from the really, really experienced coaches. So we're talking coaches that have coached thousands, including multiple world champions in powerlifting, hundreds of national champions at a very high level, including beginners, intermediates, and all sorts of people. And obviously the elite powerlifters that we interviewed. Then triangulating that with the 3 studies that we did, although, they have the limitations, results sort of confirmed that, a few heavy sets per week. And that, there's no sure, we had a specific protocol that we used, but that was literally pulled out of my head because it made sense from an ecological validity standpoint. And my own personal experience as a coach informed the design, where we did squat twice a week, bench 3 times a week, and deadlift once a week. But, the results essentially showed that a few heavy sets that can be anywhere between 1 to 5 reps and potentially even higher are enough for meaningful strength gains in 6 to 12 weeks. So for ecological validity, I would look at those studies, because we are drawing upon expert opinion, and also looking at experienced athletes specifically training with a minimum effective training dose, rather than, okay, let's just look at their bench and their squat, but they're also doing other things. So yeah, overall, I don't think that the existing literature back then, and I did rerun some of the searches in 2021 when I was defending my PhD, and I didn't find anything new. Maybe there's been a few studies since then, but overall, I wouldn't look at those studies that made it into the meta-analysis for a ton of ecological validity when it comes to the concept of minimum effective training dose and 1 RM strength. However, in 1 RM strength in specific lifts. However, the results of the meta-analysis, I do think have some ecological validity for your average individual who goes to the gym and wants to get stronger, doesn't really care about 1 repetition maximum strength in the same sense that a powerlifter does. But they're yeah, you know what? I do chest day, but I also want my bench to go up. What can I do? I do think that then there is ecological validity in the design of those studies for those people, because, the average person is not just going to do SBD at the gym and nothing else. So if I was a powerlifter or somebody who's like really looking to experiment with the concept of the minimum effective training dose for 1 repetition maximum strength, and I want to specialize in 1 repetition maximum strength, I would look at the multi-experiment paper. But I do think that the systematic review and meta-analysis, and I'm not like focusing on a specific study, but overall the studies with the different designs, I do think they offer some value to the average individual who will be doing other lifts as well.
And I guess to clarify, if I didn't explain it enough earlier for anyone listening, the inclusion criteria was 1 set per exercise, but some studies, like the Schoenfeld study, used multiple exercises for the legs, for example. So they used, I think, leg extension, squat, and leg press, and they trained 3 times per week. And so even though it was 1 set per exercise, they're doing 9 sets per week, as opposed to like the Marshall study where they were only doing back squat for their legs, and they did 1 set twice per week. So it's 2 sets per week for the legs versus 9. But just to go a little deeper into that Marshall study, I think that one and the RIA study, which I think was 3 sets per week, and also only did bench press and I think it was squat for the legs and for like a pressing motion, also found results that sort of match what you found in your study. So even if you looked into the individual studies, I think it all kind of still points in the direction of your conclusion and supports it. I'm curious.
You took me back now with saying the name Marshall. 2011.
Yeah, 2011, and the real one was 2002, which, I guess on an aside, what you were saying about looking through the data, again, or rerunning the same search, I don't think people understand just how many studies there really are to draw from, because like when I'm, diving through research on like this topic or other topic, I'm regularly looking at like the late 1990s, like early 2000s, with lots of papers that are still relevant to today, and you could miss out on a lot of what's there if you don't have like a perfect search criteria. But
yeah, it's like the assumptions that are often made in our field. And by field, I mean not the academic side, because like that's another whole kind of worms. Like if we start separating the academics and the researchers versus the, because we're both educators but also researchers. As a researcher, I care about all the minute details. I care about, like, we do a meta-analysis or a systematic review. Everything needs to be like detailed. Everything needs to make sense. We need to search, extract, sort out studies, do multiple searches, multiple databases. But when it comes to the educator side of things, the way we communicate things sometimes, and look, you can't avoid it. Like, you can't be throwing 25 disclaimers every time you want to make a post about, or a video about, hey, train with a few sets per week and that will get you solid results. Like, that's what the average person needs to hear as a practical takeaway. They don't necessarily need to know the way you got there and the entirety of the literature and the limitations. But when you look behind the scenes, people assume that, we have all these studies where, like, you've got these huge labs and teams of scientists that take, like, these super trained individuals and they do all sorts of, like, protocols. And then you look behind the curtain and it's like, 6 studies or, like, 8. And some with, like, limitations. And then when you grade those studies, some may be of low quality or they may have a high risk of bias. And then how did you rate those studies? You did it using that one tool that you had to modify because it's not appropriate for those types of like, it's a bit of a mess behind the scenes. Not a bad mess. It's a mess that, like, that's science. But I do feel like a lot of people assume that there's so much more there, and like when they hear the word data, they just, like, there's a sound that comes on. They're like, data, and they're like, whoa. The data said it. And it's like, the data is 3 studies with, like, 20 people.
And it's
total.
The data also, which I think is also interesting. And I catch myself doing the same thing. Like, the research says. I'm like, well, maybe not the research. Just some of the research that I've looked at says this, and some of it probably says elsewise. And
yeah, exactly. But it's tricky though, like, because you have to find, and I'm digressing a bit, but like, you have to find that balance, because at the same time, like, being an educator is not the same as being a scientist or a researcher. Like, delivering, like, educating people, especially people that don't care about the the terms and conditions of science. Sure, mentioning some limitations and being cautious is extremely important, but you have to find that balance between, okay, now I've stopped listening because the guy is going over, like, he's going in way too much depth here, and okay, this is way too simplistic and may make people think that they only need to do this one thing,
sure.
you know?
So I'd like to kind of go down the list of some training variables that people might commonly look at if they were trying to build a program. And I know we've talked a lot about strength so far, but we can talk kind of a little bit about both strength and muscle growth here, and look at what we have in terms of research and like what your thoughts are in terms of the minimum effective dose per each of these variables. And we can start with volume, which when I first did my kind of deep dive into research on this type of stuff maybe a year or two ago, a lot of what I found seemed to point to volume as being really important. I know that there are kind of some disagreements maybe between whether volume or proximity to failure is more important or whatnot, but it seemed like if you held other things the same, if you just increase your volume, or if you have the correct amount of volume or the same amount of volume rather, that you'd have more muscle growth or the same muscle growth. So what are your thoughts first on volume research in general? I know there's a lot there, and there's been kind of fingers being pointed in one direction or another about people being funded by the big volume corporation. And just in general, what you think about the relationship of volume and strength gains and muscle gains and how that kind of plays into your framework for the minimum effective dose of volume for the same.
Yeah, it's like people don't like to view things in context. They also have, like, I think it's human nature to an extent, the need to, oh yeah, this is there's a big conspiracy that it's like people are talking about, like Brad Schoenfeld and the infamous criticisms of, the studies from the lab where there's like one study, he didn't blind the ultrasound. Yes, because he was the ultrasound technician and he didn't have the master's program going on at the time, so he couldn't leave the undergraduate students unsupervised doing the data collection. And sure, it's a limitation, take it in consideration, but then we're looking at the totality of the literature, not the one study. So that's been that's been like a big source of like controversy, but the controversy stems mostly from people parroting things that other people have said, which essentially creates this feeling of a conspiracy and bias, when in reality, and Menno said that on the Revive Stronger podcast with Josh Pelland, Sam Buckner, and Holly Baxter, when they were talking about volume, that a lot of the stuff that Brad does has directly gone against his own claims from books that he sells, or his previous hypotheses. And the idea that there's a conspiracy to show that more volume equals more gains, I don't know. I don't understand the thinking behind that, because anyways, I'm now defending people, but I just don't get the thinking there, because if anything, like, the conspiracy would have been the opposite, like do less to gain more, and less is more, which we were seeing in the literature back in the day, but that was a whole kind of, like, I'm ADHDing to the extreme now. All that to say that in the context of the minimum effective training dose, actually in general, training volume, yeah, there does seem to be a dose response between training volume and muscle growth. Now, does that mean that more equals a ton more? No, but more is probably more in some cases, and for the individuals that care about that. The same way, if you were to instead of making, and I always use this silly analogy, like if you were looking at investments, you could make a few basic investments that are tested for time and, have a solid income and just keep investing and have an amazing retirement. Or you could spend much more time looking into investing and taking risks and doing this and making educated bets and potentially have even more money that for some people will make a meaningful difference. For others, they'll be like, bro, I am not going to spend 10, 15 years of my life caring about all this, or, an extra few hours in the gym and less time with my kids or less time with my loved ones to have slightly bigger biceps that may not be visually like noticeable, So if we are geeking out about training volume and gains, and we're trying to get closer to the truth for the sake of getting closer to the truth, that's a different context to as like meaningful gains and getting jacked and strong. So all that to say, training volume is important for muscle growth. There comes a point where more may not be more, but if your life depends on it and you are seeing that things are not changing, yeah, doing a bit more and going in the 20 to 30 set range for some muscle groups here and there may make some sense. But that's it. Like, as long as you're between 5 to 10 sets, you're going to make the majority of your gains, and for some people it may be close to all of their gains. So, and that's why I said 3 to 6 sets as a minimum effective dose. You're looking at like a solid 80-85% of potential gains, possibly from that number of sets. Maybe 85% is a bit too high. Like let's leave 80 to 85% for 5 to 10 sets, and say a bit less for 3 to 6 sets. So that's training volume in the most complicated and long way I could have possibly
Gotcha.
said.
Yeah. 2 points. One being, when I looked through, like if we go back to that meta-analysis, when I was looking and kind of crunching the numbers, it seemed like for strength at least, it was like maybe between 40 and 60%. You would get maybe between 40 and 60% of the gains in the lower volume group as the high volume group. But that's also, you have to consider you're getting roughly half of the gains for 1/9 of the sets in a lot of cases, or 1/3 of the sets, which I think is important to take into account. And the second thing was, I don't know what your thoughts are. Again, I'll take you back in time. The Marshall study, I don't know if any others that looked at it this way, but they looked at it in terms of high responders, medium responders, and low responders. I think high responders being people who gained like 30% on their 1RM, medium responders something like 20%, and low responders something like 10%. And there were high responders, medium responders, and low responders in all of the groups. So some of the people in the lowest volume group were still getting 30% increases, although it seemed like there was a trend where you were less likely to be one of those high responders if you were in the low volume group, and the more volume you were doing, the more likely you were to be in that high responder group. So my whole point with bringing this up is, I'm curious what your thoughts are on like individual differences, and like applying this at an n=1 kind of level where, like I wrote a blog post about this a while ago, where I guess one example would be like vegetarians, right? People will say, if you're vegetarian, it's typically more difficult for you to get protein in, and this could be detrimental because you won't have as much muscle mass. And you could name a bunch of other examples, but my point is, if you're a vegetarian and you're jacked and super strong, you don't really need to worry about that as much, right? If you just look at it from like an n=1 level. So like applying this, maybe you're doing like 10 sets per week and you are like gassed, but you've made huge gains and you're making great progress, but you really don't feel like you can go higher. Maybe you kind of take that personal perspective into account with maybe what the research shows. Anyway, I'll stop babbling. I'll see what you think about that.
No, but that's an extremely solid point and a really, really good way to phrase it, and a top question. 3 compliments there for the one question. But honestly, like, and that's what people miss. And like, no matter how many times you say it, no matter how many times you say, okay, guys, evidence-based practice, research lays the base, gives us like Eric Helms had put it in a way that I liked. It's like the research is like having like a torch or like a candle in a dark maze, and it just allows you to see in front of you, right? Like you're not having one of those insanity torches like Mr. Beast had in one of his videos, where the brightest torch that you could see like miles and miles away. Anyways, extreme the ADHD today, but you're supposed to take that sense of direction and adjust based on how you're recovering, how you're responding, and whether you're enjoying whatever you're doing. So for me personally, I've been blessed with, I'll take my legs as an example. When I started squatting, I squatted 440 within the first month of squatting. Yes, I was a heavy guy, but I was like 20 years old and I had never squatted seriously before. Even now, I do 1 set of squats per week at like 1 to 3 repetitions, and I can still squat 5 plates despite having not squatted for a while. And I have relatively big legs, quads, hamstrings, and glutes from barely doing any training for my legs. Yes, I have a strong deadlift and I train the deadlift, but like if you look at my weekly sets, we're talking at like a maximum of 6 sets per week, max. And like the average being closer to 3, and we're talking about like low rep sets and like a few reps in reserve for the majority of time. I like that has worked for me. Sure, if you said, "Hey, Pac, $1 million if you get your legs up to 35 inches in diameter without gaining more fat," yes, then I would push things more and more and more. But I wouldn't take what the research has shown in some studies where 20 to 30 sets have shown even more hypertrophy and jump from 3 sets to 20 to 30. But I would slowly ramp up volume, and based on my recovery and based on obviously the muscle growth experience, which can be difficult to measure on an individual level, because how are you measuring it? You're measuring it via visual assessment and maybe circumference measures that have other limitations. So then I would take the research and adapt it to my personal preference and how I'm responding. Another example of that is like I have some clients that are hard gainers, and they're hard gainers that's verified. They've been doing 10 to 15 sets per muscle group per week, while keeping a track of their session RPE. So like sessions feel relatively manageable. Because like if you're doing 10 to 20 sets per week and you are unable to walk after each workout, maybe you're doing too much. But like they're doing 10 to 20 sets, the sessions are manageable, multiple exercise per muscle group, all the mumbo jumbo optimization, like emphasizing the stretch and like doing multiple exercises per muscle group, and they've been gaining body weight, eating plenty of protein, sleeping enough, not having too much stress, and still they're not seeing the response that I saw when I started lifting in the first 2 to 3 years, probably because of genetics. Now, for those people looking at the volume literature and seeing that, okay, there are cases where even more volume led to more growth, let me now experiment with that and see if that gives me something. I think that's valuable. But when it comes to n equals 1, people need to understand that those ranges are just a mere like sense of direction that you can explore and see if that works for you. And if it works for you, it can be sometimes tricky to understand. But if you're recovering really well from whatever you're doing and you feel like you could do more, and at the same time you're not satisfied with the growth you're seeing, assuming nutrition and recovery are on point, sure, you could try and do a bit more. But if you're happy, like for me with my legs, like I'm not investigating it further. Yes, the literature says that I could probably do more and gain more, but I don't care.
Yeah, for sure.
You get me?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Continuing a little further on a little bit of a tangent with volume, I wrote a blog post a little while ago kind of about specialization and how for maybe more intermediate or like advanced lifters that have hit plateaus, specialization might be a good idea based on kind of 3 premises. One being potentially what people would consider like ultra high volumes may be more productive for building more muscle, especially once you've been training for a while. The second premise being that minimum effective volume for just maintaining muscle is extremely low. So in other words, just dropping to like 4 sets per week for a muscle group is not going to leave that muscle group to disintegrate. And then the third idea was based largely off of kind of one study by, I think it's Agasawara and colleagues, where they looked at 2 groups. One was continuously training. They were untrained subjects at the beginning. They were continuously training for like, I forget how long it was. And then the other group would train for 6 weeks, take 3 weeks off, train for 6 weeks, take 3 weeks off, and then train for 6 weeks. So that's, let's see, do the math, 18, maybe it was 24 weeks total. And what they saw was the group that was continuously training, saw their beginner gains and then they started to plateau a little bit. And the other group would see in the first 6 weeks also beginner gains. Then they would drop in their kind of strength. And then in the follow-on 6 weeks, when they started training again, they would see similar progress to their beginner gains. In other words, the acceleration of their gains wouldn't plateau. It would go back to that kind of original fast acceleration. And so my whole point being, for like intermediate or advanced lifters, you could really hammer down on your side delts, for example, for like 2 months, 3 months, while putting other muscle groups at lower volumes in order to make room, with like recovery, resources, so to speak, and then take a couple of months where you drop your side delt volume to resensitize them and also allow like, joints and related soft tissue to kind of recover while prioritizing something else. So I'm curious if whatever I just said makes sense at all based on kind of what you've seen in the research, then also just practically from training, high-level athletes for a while.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. I would just be a bit cautious with like joints and other potential damage there. Like if the feedback is positive from whoever you're working with or yourself, then I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, okay, yeah, let's take a break now because there's some damage being happening in the behind the scenes that will cause us issues. But that's just my personal opinion, right? But yeah, the concept of the minimum effective dose is something that you can apply exactly in the way that you said. You put some things on a minimum effective dose or like a minimum maintenance dose. I'd argue like could be as low as like 1 to 2 sets per week. To maintain muscle mass, I think is relatively easy, assuming, proximity to failure is there. But I definitely agree with your view of the concept in the sense that your entire training doesn't need to be on a minimum effective training dose. It could be that you're, as you said, specializing on one muscle group and making space for that muscle group to be trained with very high volumes by doing less on other things. But again, like we don't really know for a fact, like we don't know a lot about resensitization and allowing, giving a break to a muscle group and whether that training it with lower volumes after training it with higher volumes for long periods of time, whether that definitely will lead to more growth in the future. Sure. There's a really cool article on Stronger by Science called Grow Like a New Lifter Again that dives into some of the nuances there. But as it stands, what we do know is that taking a week off or taking some time off or training with lower volumes here and there is not going to cause harm, and you're still going to be able to make gains. So worst case scenario, even if you don't end up, now my delts are going to grow like newbie delts again, worst case scenario, they still grew and you didn't lose any size and you had more time to do whatever else you wanted to do. So yeah, that's essentially my perspective there. But I do think that the volume research does lend itself well to specialization phases, especially when looking at the very high volume end of things. And it's an educated bet, right? For some people, those things matter. And again, worst case scenario, what's the worst that can happen? You didn't gain more muscle and you trained longer and had a bit more fun in the gym, and that comes with other benefits like, socializing or still keeping that flame alive. And after a point as lifters, like I've been lifting for 12 years.
Probably
and
something
you've
similar.
You've been lifting for how long? So like there will come a point in the next, few years or so where, unless like I haven't trained my calves directly ever. Sure, I could do like calf training or like forearm training. But for everything else, we're pretty much looking at minute changes, if any changes. Like, sure, I could lose body fat and look different or whatever, but the name of the game then becomes much different, and like doing that specialization phase, I may not gain anything or I may not know, and it may be that, I look a bit, like my arm measures slightly higher because of, I don't know, swelling or whatnot. But at the same time, it may also be fun. So, and we have literature to show that it may actually lead to some more growth. So there's no need to like be triggered and be like, oh no, why are they recommending these high volumes? Nobody's recommending 20 to 30 sets for the average individual. It's a context matters.
And I should give credit where credit's due. I think the first place I kind of heard about this concept was from a post by James Krieger, where I think it was maybe he calls it like the volume Bible or frequency Bible, something like that. But yeah, I think it's also, even for people who aren't looking to optimize,
classic.
Maybe people who just don't have that much time to spend and they're not seeing like I said, like maybe their side delts just aren't growing, but they can't afford to add in, an hour per week of extra side delt sets, going from like 8 sets per week to 12. Maybe they could just drop their leg volume down, a few sets per week or whatever, to just like a maintenance dose to make time in their training for, whatever muscle group they wanted to prioritize a little bit. Not even doing anything crazy like, like you said, 20 sets per week.
Yeah. What I do think is it can be a bit harmful sometimes is, and I've seen people ask me that, like, making people feel as if like you're gonna lose gains unless you maintain the volume that you used to be doing. Like, the data on that I think is relatively clear. Relatively clear, I think is fair. Like, you're not going to be losing gains if you're still engaging in high intensity of effort resistance training, even if it's substantially less than what you were used to doing before.
All right, enough of this volume nonsense. I'm curious what your thoughts are with proximity to failure. I know there's been a lot coming out about this recently. There was one meta-analysis that showed that going a few reps shy of failure is just as good. Another one came out saying that the closer you go to failure is better. And I think there are ongoing studies coming out. So I'm curious what you think in general, and then from a minimum effective dose perspective, what you think if you're cutting back your volume, for example, to save time, how that affects your perspective on proximity to failure with your sets.
Yeah, like, so a lot of people again lost their minds when the series of meta regressions by Robinson et al. Came out, where it showed that, hey, training closer to failure, best for hypertrophy. And obviously, like, if you look at the way they did their analysis, and like that, there's obviously limitations, but the practical takeaway there, it wasn't, oh, you should do every set to failure, but hey, if you're trying to maximize muscle growth, being very close to failure and occasionally maybe reaching failure is a good idea, just to ensure that you're making an educated bet, and you want to make sure that you're not leaving no stone unturned. If we were to take, like, 1,000 twins and split them in two groups, and one group did, like, we had like a futuristic device that could definitely tell them reps in reserve, would tell them, yep, this is 100% 2 reps in reserve, and we compared that with a group going 0 reps in reserve, I wouldn't expect any major differences to exist as far as muscle growth goes. But in practice, and so this is where being evidence based comes in handy. In practice, there are, although the data that we have on gauging proximity to failure shows that most people are relatively good at gauging proximity to failure, in practice, and mind you, some of those papers come from our group as well, or at least a collaboration of our group with other groups. In practice, I do see trainees often not being that great at training close to failure. All that to say, for hypertrophy, yes, being close to failure seems to be pretty important. Whether that's 0 or 2 reps in reserve, I don't think that makes a huge difference. Ideally, you'd keep most things in that 0 to 2 rep in reserve range, preferably not taking all sets to failure. But in the context of the minimum effective training dose, I would say that if you're going super low, and you're going like low, like you're going 2 to 3 sets per muscle group per week, doing more sets close to failure versus not, I personally would recommend that, to have the peace of mind that, yep, those sets were actually of a high enough intensity of effort, plus training to failure can be an easy way to auto-regulate your progression. So, like, if you're doing, let's say, chin-ups, and you're like aiming for failure, it's a very easy way that doesn't require any sort of thinking while doing the set, to know that, okay, my goal now is to just do these until I can't anymore. I did 10 last week, now I managed 11. Whereas if you are gauging proximity to failure, for some people, there are days and there are other factors that may influence your ability to accurately gauge that, maybe like mental fatigue from being on your phone before, or a bad night of sleep, or whatever. So for me, training to failure in the context of the minimum effective training dose is a nice way to know that you are getting the most you can out of those few sets, and at the same time can make progression easy. But if you said, hey, Pac, I'm okay at gauging proximity to failure regardless of how I've slept or whatever, and I know that I'm for sure at a 2 RIR, I've been lifting for 15 years, and that's what I'll do, I'm like, okay, that's totally fine. and you're probably not missing out on gains. As far as strength goes, the data from the same series of meta regressions did show that being further away from failure is probably best for strength, and that makes sense. In our studies, we didn't do that because the idea was, okay, let's address specificity, and I also wanted the individuals that took part to feel somewhat confident. Like in order to convince powerlifters to take part in a study where they're only doing a handful of reps, if you also told them, hey, you're going to keep those reps at like 4 to 5 reps in reserve, it's likely that a lot of them would have gone, yeah, I'm not feeling like 2 months of easy singles here, So yeah, in our case, we did find that you can make meaningful gains by being at a relatively close proximity to failure. And keep in mind, we weren't to failure. We were still like 2 to 3 reps, 2 to 3. Like it was like a 0 to 3 reps in reserve because there were sets that were terminated at like 9.5 RPE. So for strength, if you're training with a minimum effective training dose, unfortunately, we don't have a ton of data on like very low volumes and being like 4 to 6 reps in reserve. But I would say, again, a combination of both probably makes sense, just to be not 100% sure, but just to be more on the safe side, because, hey, you don't know. So yeah, I'd say definitely not 0 to 2 reps in reserve, but I'd stay somewhere in the 1 to 4 reps in reserve mark for those few heavy sets. It's just important to remember that using a heavier load there is what you really want versus, I'm going to do a set of 15 reps and leave 3 reps in reserve, because that was the guidelines that Pac said on that one podcast.
Yeah. Pushing a little further into this, what are your thoughts on like intensity techniques like drop sets, Maya reps, and then also maybe not quite an intensity technique, but like supersets in terms of the minimum effective dose? I know there's some research on that, and I'm curious like what you think in terms of actual application. And also, before you answer that, do you have like a time cutoff? I want to be respectful of your time here.
Ideally,
okay.
Another like 15, 20 minutes. If that's cool. But because obviously we had like the issues with the call that time. Like, it's totally understandable. But I do think, supersets, I probably haven't made enough of a fuss about them in the context of minimum effective dose training. And I do think that they're an amazing way to literally save a lot of time while still getting plenty of stimulus in. Obviously, direct research, somewhat limited, but if you're pressed for time and you're doing push-ups and then you're doing, lat pull-downs, I think as a superset, I think that's an amazing way to save even more time. You're likely not sacrificing much as far as hypertrophy goes. And yeah, also might make for an awesome pump. So totally up for supersets.
And drop sets and like my rep type sets and stuff like that. Do you same exact response? Like, again, if you're in the gym and you are just doing your best, you're limited in terms of time, and you go in and you bang out a few very hard sets, including some drop sets or Maya reps. If you're staying with at a close proximity to failure, that's a big thumbs up. Cool. So kind of also going towards time-saving decisions and also going down the training variables. When it comes to exercise selection, I've looked in a little bit into some of the research on multi-joint versus single joints, particularly whether like compound movements, like a bench press, for example, grow the secondary muscles involved. So like in this case, it would be like the triceps, as much as an isolation exercise. The point being, if you can grow your chest, your front delts, and your triceps all sufficiently with a bench press, then you don't have to do extra sets of isolation exercises. You can cut those out and cut down a lot of time on your out of your training. So I'm curious what you think in general with that, and then also like from a layperson's perspective, because I at least expect, I guess I'll throw out my assumption, that you might say, like there are particular heads of certain muscles that might not be trained sufficiently in multi-joint movements, like the long head of the triceps. You might need some overhead, like an overhead exercise to hit that. So in general, I guess what you think, but then also like the stuff like that, training those like biarticular muscles really matter that much from like a layperson perspective that's not really in for optimization or anything.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly that. Like, again, it depends on the context. So, I recently put out a free minimum dose training protocol for hypertrophy, a 2-day one. You can find it at minimumdosetraining.com. It's totally free. Like, there's no like sales pitch, no newsletter, no nothing. It's just a sheet. And that was made for those who are in the more like optimization, maximization sort of side of things, but want to train with a minimum effective dose. For those people, I do think that, hey, if you're a bodybuilder or like a muscle nerd and you are, training with a minimum effective training dose, it may make sense to do the things that you just mentioned, like do some overhead tricep extensions and maybe some form of a leg extension, or something to fully target your quads. But for the average person, if you're pressed for time, opting for compound movements, and if you have access to a gym, machine-based, non-plate loaded compound exercises is your best bet. Like, why would you spend a ton of time doing tricep pushdowns and bicep curls when you could be doing, a machine row, a chest press, or like a machine shoulder press, where you can literally just sit, select the weight that you want, and still get a solid stimulus for your front delts and triceps. Again, the context there is average person who wants to be relatively jacked, relatively strong, and is pressed for time. Could they be gaining a bit more if they did some isolated tricep work? Probably yes. Do I think it makes a lot of sense for them to prioritize that and potentially miss out on, chest and front delt work by forcing the overhead extensions? No. But then that's where your previous question comes in handy. So, like, you could do supersets or something along those lines and get, have your cake and eat it too.
Cool. Now that we've covered kind of some of those training variables, I'm curious what your thoughts are or what your preferences are in terms of, I know you just said you have the free minimal effective dose training program, of how someone might break this up if they were, for example, when you were in the heat of your P.h.D. Work, you really didn't have time to go to the gym. You could maybe do like one full body session a week just to maintain or make slight gains, or you could do like wake up 10 minutes of like bro split pretty much per day. Or you could do like 2 really short 20-minute like upper body, lower body splits. What do you think works well, or maybe with people you've worked with, what have you seen works well, or that you like to do in terms of your kind of protocols for planning out your training during the week from like a minimum effective dose perspective?
Yeah, I mean, that will also depend on the overall setup of the person as well, right? I was, because I was blessed to be working from home when doing the PhD, and because of the pandemic, I also had equipment at home, and we were training at home anyways. But for the majority of people, like, look at your schedule, see what is realistically the most training you can fit in per week. Is it one session? Okay, full body could be an option there. Again, prioritizing time efficient exercises that are compound exercises, and bodyweight exercises can be amazing for that. So like a chin up and push up superset, where you're literally using just your own body weight, unless you're like a calisthenics athlete, you're looking at very easily very time efficient, effective hypertrophy stimulus that you can literally bang out. You can get your lats, upper back, biceps, triceps, chest, front delts. You can give all those muscle groups a top stimulus in literally, like, if you were to make a bet, 5 minutes. Like, if you said, okay, timer on, focus, go, and you did like a set of chin-ups, push-ups, waited 30 seconds, another set of chin-ups, push-ups, waited 30 seconds, and did that, you could get a ton of stimulus there. However, another way you could do things, if you have some equipment at home, or if you're the super busy, like the busiest person on earth, and you know that you will be the busiest person on earth for the next few years, like invest in some dumbbells, some push-up handles, maybe a chin-up bar at home, and you could play around with the concept of exercise snacks, where you have like short bursts of physical activity throughout the day. So let's say after this call, I'm that kind of person. Okay, time to bang out a set of chin-ups and then some push-ups and then some, I don't know, bicep curls or lateral raises or whatever. Do that for 5 minutes, do like a little circuit, one set of each, leave it. Later in the day, do the same. And just make sure that you do get 1 to 3 sets as a minimum per muscle group per week, even if those sets are not direct sets. So in that case, you could think of it as a lift-specific sort of volume instead of thinking as muscle groups. Go like, okay, I have these exercises, 1 to 3 sets, 1 to 3 hard sets per week, and you can be very creative with how you get that in. And the good thing with science is that science has showed us that, look, you want to do 20 reps for hypertrophy, do 20 reps. Want to do 5 to 10 reps, do that. Want to use free weights? Sure. Want to use your body weight? Fine. Want to use machines? Okay. Like, things are very flexible. Just see how much time you have. If you don't know and your time changes every week, you can literally freestyle your training. You don't need to have a set schedule or a set program. You could just say, okay, I have these volume landmarks to hit, volume goals to hit, and I will hit them whenever I can during the week.
Sweet. All right, so to wrap it up, I have a few kind of rapid-fire questions for you to answer maybe in like 30 or 60 seconds if you're up for it. All right. Number one, sure. What is your kind of minimum effective dose protocol for health? So like living longer, but particular also living better for longer. What are like the really big movers that can kind of give people the 80-20 in your perspective?
Yeah, 150 minutes of vigorous or 300 minutes of moderate physical activity per week. So that could be literally 6,000 to 10,000 steps per day and about 60 minutes of lifting per week. I think if you hit the latter, so like around 6,000 to 10,000 steps per day and 60 minutes of lifting per week, you are taking a lot of boxes. And people often forget that being healthy is not the same as being fit. Sure, in order to be healthy, you need to be at a certain level of fitness, but there's a difference between being good at running long distances or having a really high endurance versus being fit enough to remain alive and be quote-unquote functional for daily activities. And with those guidelines, I'd say most people are going to be equipped to face most things in life.
All right, what is your current training breakdown look like from week to week?
Yeah. It's a freestyle o'clock. Like I have specific lifts that I do consistently, like the deadlift. Like I squat at the moment, so only thing I'm doing for legs is squat and deadlifts. I am chasing a 300 kilo deadlift, so my deadlift training has, I'm focusing slightly on it. I overhead press every week, 3 to 5 times. Singles, sets of 5. I just love overhead pressing, and I do the same exercises, just not necessarily in the exact same order or the exact same sessions. But I try to keep exercise pretty consistent, and my training is like 90 to 95% hypertrophy focused, and I'm around the 6 to 12 set range for the majority of muscle groups, aside from legs.
And so I've heard you talk a lot about science communication and misunderstanding science and research. What is your advice to someone who maybe doesn't have formal training in like a Ph.D. or M.D. circumstance for reading and understanding research literature, and even just sifting through, listening to a bunch of different people who supposedly know everything about what they're talking about, and kind of identifying people who they can trust and listen to?
Investigating some form of like following a research review. Mass research review if you're more like science inclined, and Reps research review, which I was leading up until recently. Cool resources. There's plenty of other research reviews as well. I think that's a good way to go about it. I know a lot of people are not going to do that, but I'd say the best way is to look at, hey, what is the consensus among quote unquote experts? But also make sure to occasionally remind yourself that it's really not that deep. And if you're doing, if you're just literally going to the gym and training with a high intensity of effort and doing that consistently, doing literally the most, basic or common exercises, following the most basic or common technique guidelines, and if you're doing that for the rest of your life, you are likely
Gotcha.
to be just.
All right, now this one should be a softball, which is, can you summarize the minimum effective dose for resistance training for strength and hypertrophy?
Yeah, sure. So, based on the totality of the current, based on the current literature, as little as a handful of sets per muscle group or per lift per week seem to be enough for one to make meaningful strength and hypertrophy gains, assuming that for hypertrophy those sets are at a very close proximity to failure, and for strength that sufficiently heavy load is used. So I think that's the easiest way. That's the most summarized.
Gotcha. And the last one, I am a big Mike Israetel fan, and right now the chances of him ever responding to me or speaking to me are virtually nil. But I know he loves comedy and he loves insulting himself. So I would like to give you the floor to, in 10 seconds, give your best Mike Israetel insult, preferably in the Bane voice. The Bane voice. I've listened to you with your phenomenal Bane voice.
How do you know I can do a good Bane voice? Yes. Insult. We're visiting Mike at some point soon, so I'll keep the insult for after the visit.
Okay.
And the roasting, but because I'm thinking, and I have plenty of stuff that I could say, but I would say to his face and off air because I don't want to get canceled, and he would laugh, I assume, or kill me, which is also totally fine. So I'll just, I don't know, do just the Bane voice and go, it doesn't matter who we are. What matters is our plan. No one cared who I was till I put on the mask. If I pull that off, will you die? It would be extremely painful.
That was good. That suffices.
Big guy.
I just want to say that was a test, and
Thank
to
you.
all the high volume critics, even though you're minimum effective dose guy, that proves you're incorruptible. Before we close it off, where can people find you on social media and everything else if they want to follow you and maybe use some of your services?
Well, they can find me outside because we are outside. But aside from that, Linktree. So it's linktr. So linktr.ee/drpak. That's where all my links are. And that's where I would say they can find me. I'm obviously on Instagram, and I'm also on YouTube, Dr. Pack. Sure, it's cringe, but hey, can't brand Pack or Patroklos Androulakis Korakakis. Sue me, but
all right, awesome,
yeah,
man.
That's where they can find me.
All right, that wraps it up for this episode of the Shortcut U podcast. I strongly recommend you go check out some of Dr. Pack's content, especially his YouTube channel, where he posts relevant health and fitness content regularly. I think he does a great job of keeping things simple and understandable without losing accuracy and while also keeping things evidence-based. And if you want more content like this, you can check out the rest of the Shortcut U channel, as well as Shortcut U on Substack.com, where I share blog posts and videos regularly with a bunch of research-based health and fitness content. And also, if you really like this conversation, go check out the other one I did with Dr. Milo Wolf, who's a friend of Dr. Pax. He's another Ph.D. in sports science. We had a great conversation about a bunch of other topics related to resistance training and health and fitness in general. And with that, thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.